So dear students, we are about to start our chapter number 3. Which chapter is it? It is Risk Assessment and Internal Control. What? Risk Assessment? Internal Control. Same portion you have learned in your inter. One of the basic mistakes which students do is that they will, like planning chapter, the chapter number 2, they will ignore. But at times, questions are asked from this chapter. So weightage would be like, if asked, 4 to 6 marks, including in the MCQ part. Now, in this chapter, we will be covering some essays, say like essay 315, 330, 265, etc. And I should say that essay 315 is very important. What? Identify and assessing the ROMM, risk of material misstatement. In this chapter, I have added 2 videos. The first video will be on chapter name's first part, risk assessment. And the second video will be on internal control. And students, kindly don't leave off this chapter. Even though it is very basic, students tend to leave and asked in the exams at times. So, shall we start? Okay, students. So, we are starting chapter number 3, which is risk assessment and internal control. Come on, what is the link between the word risk assessment and internal control? Okay. Where internal controls are weak, wherever the internal controls are weak, there risk will be more. Students, I will be saying risk of material misstatement, in short, ROMM, ROMM. Okay. So, wherever the internal controls are weak, there ROMM will be more. If the internal controls are strong, the chances of misstatement, in our words, ROMM will be less. So, to assess the ROMM or to assess the risk, we should understand the entity's internal control. Are we clear on chapter's name? Okay. Now, moving on to the overview of the chapter. What all are there in this chapter? First one, as the chapter name suggests, it is relating to risk assessment. Students, risk assessment, it is essay. You are correct. Essay 315 followed by essay 330. Okay. So I'll give you a brief summary of essay 330 and mainly we will be dealing with essay 315. So that is the first part. Second, as the chapter name suggests, that second part which is regarding the internal control. All those the basic concepts regarding the internal control. Now, I'm coming in that flow. We have assessed the risk. To assess the risk, we understood about the internal control. When we understand about deficiencies in internal control, shouldn't we communicate? So that's the third one. How do we communicate the deficiencies in internal control? There I can link it with essay 265. If you remember, essay 265, okay, 265 essay deals with communicating the deficiencies in internal control. Fine. So that's the third part. And finally, there is a concept which is called as RBA, which is risk-based audit. Where you will identify the areas in which there is risk and you will conduct the audit. So that is also related in this chapter. So in this chapter, there is risk assessment, internal control, related concepts. If you have observed, through this chapter, we will be covering around 3 essays. We will be summarizing 3 essays, which is your 315, 330, which is your 265. Okay. So, shall we start with the first portion? Which is the first portion? It is, you're correct, which is the risk assessment. Yeah. Starting with the first one, which is risk assessment. Before I go into the depth of the portion, I will say which essay it is related and what are the broad things which we will be covering. So, I'm giving you an overview of the risk assessment, which is our first portion. First, let me link it with the essay. The first thing which we have in the risk assessment is essay 315. You remember essay 315 name? Identifying and assessing the risk of material misstatement through understanding the entity and its environment. Okay, so entirely in this portion of risk assessment, it is from essay 315, and of course we can also relate essay 330 where you will respond to the assessed risk. Clear? So, what all things are we going to cover here? First, what is audit risk? Okay. Second, as an auditor, what is your objective in essay 315? And finally, to assess the risk, shouldn't you understand the environment? Essay name tells us so. That environment will include what? Internal control. So the third part will be components of IC. IC means internal control. So students, we are going to cover here 3 topics which is related to mainly essay 315. Yeah, 315 and 330 also. Okay. So starting with the first portion. Now, I'll be going in that same order. Okay. So first, let me write the essay. Yeah. So whatever I'm going to teach here is from your essay 315. Okay. It is standard 315. I'm not writing the name, but I'll tell you. The name is Identifying and Assessing the Risk of Material Misstatement Through Understanding the Entity and its Environment. In that, the first and the most important part is audit risk. Now, what is audit risk? Audit risk is the, so I'm mentioning about audit risk. Audit risk is the risk of what? Risk of expressing an inappropriate opinion when financial statements are what? Financial statements are materially misstated. If you carefully see the definition, for an audit risk, 2 things are mandatory. One, risk of expressing inappropriate opinion. First condition, when FS are materially misstated, then only a risk becomes the audit risk. Are we clear? Okay. Now, to put it more specifically, okay, I'm just elaborating the definition of audit risk. Does financial statement has material misstatement? Yes. Does auditor's opinion, okay, inappropriate? Yes. If these two conditions are satisfied, it becomes audit risk. Is that okay? Now, to tell the different version of this, financial statements has no material misstatement, okay, but somehow auditor's opinion is inappropriate, meaning financial statements are true and fair view, but auditor states it does not show true and fair view. Is this an audit risk? Answer would be no. It's not an audit risk. Why? Because to be an audit risk, these two conditions are cumulative. Here there is no material misstatement. Are you clear? Now, to ask few questions, is pending litigation of the company amount to audit risk? Litigation, we have heard in essay 501. Are pending litigation audit risk? Like they have a huge case of 1 crore. Is it an audit risk? No. See, it is risk to the company. I do agree. But to be an audit risk, some kind of misstatement should come in financial and he should express an inappropriate opinion. So, pending litigation is not an audit risk. Second, business always faces risk. Is business risk an audit risk? Answer would be again, business risk may not affect financial statements or financial statement will not have material misstatements. So it is not an audit risk. And finally, one more question. Auditor is facing some kind of negligence, okay, or he is having some kind of liability because auditor did some kind of negligence in the audit, he is facing a liability. Is that an audit risk? Need not be necessarily, because of his negligent carelessness he overlooked the financial statements. Financials was correct. In such circumstances, this may not be always an audit risk. I hope students you are clear with the concept of audit risk. Okay.